We're here in Poole on a fabulously sunny day in early August with Motorboat Yachting for a used boat report on the Botnia Targa 25. Now these amazing little boats have been in build since 1995 to the present day. There was actually an earlier Targa 25 which was built from 1984 to 1994, but it wasn't quite like this model range. So we're looking at the 1995 and onwards boats. And for the third time in a row, we're extremely lucky to have access to the undisputed experts in their field. And these come in the form of David and Guy Adams at Wessex Marine. They're based at Saltons Marina in Poole. And they are to Botnia Targa what Einstein was to the theory of relativity. And I'm convinced if you slice their heads off, rather like a stick of rock, there you find Botnia Targa imprinted all the way through their grey matter, hugely knowledgeable and enthusiastic grey matter as well. Anyway, they reckon, David and Guy reckon, early boats are extremely rare, but they think you might pick one up for as little as £45,000 for a 1995 boat, if you can find one, of course. That they reckon could climb to around 180,000 for a nearly new 25. And just to prove the point, the 2019 boat I'm sitting on at the moment is £179,000 including VAT. Now this does have the very biggest twin 200 horsepower Mercury outboard engine option, plus a very high specification. So that gives you an idea of the spread of prices. Now bear in mind that the GT model, which is the designation for the petrol outboard version, first saw the light of day in early 2019, and in fact this boat is the very first one off the line, and it's a February 2019 boat. So even if you want a second-hand outboard version, even the second-hand price is unlikely to be far off the £151,920 Inkbat starting price for the twin Mercury 200 horsepower model that we're sitting on, brand new. Now also bear in mind that these boats are as rare as unicorn tiers. So at this moment in time there's only one other 25 for sale on the planet, and this is a 2005 boat with a single 300 horsepower inboard diesel stern drive, and that's lying in Bath in Germany, and that's for sale for €89,000 including the VAT, I think. Anyway, while it's still beautifully hot and sunny, let's take a guided tour. Now although the 25 is the second smallest boat in the range, you'll find that generically and philosophically it's very similar to a lot of its bigger brethren. So one of the nice things about Botnia is that they don't scale things down, so you don't get weedy little fittings on the 25. They're just the same scale and solidity as you find on the bigger boats. Great big cleats down here which are the same size as the 35s and the 42s, because that's the right size for a cleat, and it gives it a very big boat feel. This doesn't feel like a 25 footer, it feels like a much bigger boat. So down here we have the standard issue deep foredeck seating area, and just stepping down here we've got plenty of lockers around this area. Like I say, other boats will be very similar indeed. Lockers here, and then yet another locker under the deck here, and then if you look closely you can see the little fitting here which takes the screw-in table leg. And even on this boat, only 25 foot, there's enough seating here to get 6 people around the table, and that's partly because Botnia have very heavily flared bows, so it gives them the space up here, and also the flare in the bow helps keep the boat very dry. So swinging round, this compartment here is the toilet, and that's one of the big differences between this and its bigger brothers, is this is one of the boats that obliges you to come outside to use the toilet compartment. The toilet compartment, by the way, is an optional extra, but apparently every single person who's bought a 25 has had this fitted, and there's only one boat, I think, that David and Guy reckon has not had the toilet module. So moving back, we've got incredibly deep bulwarks here, very safe and secure, and leading down past the walk around side decks and it's very, very easy to jump up on this boat. There are nice breaks in the guardrails here that put the bulwark down to knee level, but they're up at mid-thigh level when they're closed. We're back aft now, and we're looking at one of the areas which will possibly for you be a key buying decision. So the GT version as standard comes like this, whereas the inboard diesel stern drive version comes with a little mini flybridge or raised helm, call it what you like. Flybridge is probably a generous term, but nevertheless it's a second steering position up here. And you can mix and match, so if you do want the little mini flybridge on the outboard power boat, you can have it, and if you want to dispense with it on the diesel stern drive boat, again you can do that. But that may or may not be a key buying decision for you. I know I've driven from up there with the little outside helm, and it is a fabulous place for pilotage into strange harbours, because even though the view out from the inside helm is absolutely terrific, that extra elevation gives you something else when you're coming into strange harbours. Of course, what we're looking at represents one of the biggest decisions of all you have to make with a second-hand boat, or a new boat for that matter, which is whether to go for petrol outboards, or a single petrol outboard, or a diesel inboard. And we'll come back and talk about that in much more detail later, but we're staring at one of the big pluses of the petrol outboard, which is this big locker under the aft deck here, which you obviously lose with the diesel stern drive version, because that's where the engine is. So let me tell you about the hull shape of the Botnia Targa 25 from an ex-yacht designer's perspective. Well, in a nutshell, for a boat that can do over 50 miles an hour, it's all wrong. First off, it's quite tubby, or well, shall we say beamy to be kind, and there is a reason why boats like the 143 are slender. And its shape, its hull shape, is definitely more ouch that hurt medium V than it is wave slicing deep V, especially amidships, which is actually where you land when you're going fast. You don't land on the pointy bit at the bow. And plus, on the diesel stern drive boats, it has a whopping 660 kilograms sitting right at the back of the boat, and this in a little boat that only weighs 3,400 kilos in total. Well, fortunately, the man behind Botnia, Johan Karpelan, who founded Botnia in 1976 in Finland, didn't get the memo and forgot to read all the yacht designers' manuals, which I read. And the result is a whole range of boats which completely defy convention. And somehow they dish up one of the very best and most competent rough weather rides in the business. Actually, I must tell you a little anecdote. Years and years and years ago, I was testing a 60 mile per hour Donzi out in Poole Harbour, and David and Guy volunteered the photo boat for us. I don't think it was the 25, I think it was actually maybe the next size up. And after a couple of minutes, I had to ask David to speed up because we weren't getting the real action shots which we wanted. But rather embarrassingly, 2 minutes later, I had to ask him to slow down again, because I couldn't keep up in my 60 mile per hour quasi race boat Donzi. So I think that gives you a sort of indication of just how incredibly competent these boats are. Anyway, back to this 25. The only thing you have to guard against really in heavy weather is just over optimism. The construction is really, really sturdy, and apart from the optional cooker, which sometimes rattles a bit, the boat just never creaks or groans at all, whatever you subject it to. And when you're cocooned inside the wheelhouse, you feel almost invulnerable, and it feels much larger than it really is. So ultimately, really, it's up to you to remember that this is just a 25-foot boat, and that all 25-footers will eventually crash and bang a bit if you drive them too fast for the conditions, or your level of skill, even in a 60 mile per hour Donzi. Now, I'm not suggesting that everybody who buys a Botnia 25 is going to be Johnny No-Mates, but I think I should point out how phenomenally easy it is to handle this boat on your own, including mooring in tricky conditions. And it's all to do with the configuration. You have this fantastic wide side door immediately adjacent to the helm, and then rather conveniently placed, and I'm sure, knowing Botnia, is not by accident, you have a spring cleat in just the perfect position to pre-tie a mooring line onto, so you can nip alongside and quickly throw a spring ashore, loop it round a cleat and pull yourself in. And of course you've got two side doors, not just one as there are on some walk around boats. So handling this boat on your own is just an absolute joy. If you look at today's big flybridge cruisers, 55 foot and upwards, one of the much vaunted advantages is the private foredeck seating area, which keeps you away from the people streaming up and down the marina when you're moored stern to. Anyway, just thought I'd point out that this has a private foredeck seating area and it's only 25 foot long. You may well be obliged to come outside to use this heads compartment, but there's actually nothing wrong with the space itself. It's a nice, easy to keep clean, wipe down moulding all the way around, and headroom inside. I can just about stand up in here. Mind you, my mother was a hobbit, but putting that to one side, it's quite a nice compartment. I think one of the really nice touches is that they have bothered to put in a opening port light in there, so it can be kept nice and fresh in here. So let's talk about engines and speeds and fuel consumption. So Botnia offer a range of 5 diesel stern drives and 3 petrol outboard options. So all the diesel stern drives are Volvo and they're all single installations. So if we start at the top, we've got the most powerful is the D4 320 horsepower, and that will give you about 37 knots. There is a D6 340 listed somewhere in the files, but I really wouldn't recommend this option at all. It weighs an extra 90 kilos over the D4, and there's an extra 10 inches of engine crowding the engine room, so it really just doesn't, to me anyway, just doesn't make sense. Extra weight, less space in the engine room, probably a lot of extra money. So if we drop down to the next D4, that's the 300 horsepower version, that will give you about 36 knots. Drop down again, the D4 270, that will take you to about 34 knots. I should mention that back in 1998 when I first tested this boat, I got 35.2 knots with a 260 horsepower Volvo KAD 44. However, back then my boat weighed in at I think about 2.9 tons, whether it's now about 3.4 tons. So these sort of speeds I'm giving you do make sense in the real world. I don't think they're sort of fantasy speeds at all. And finally, the slowest stern drive diesel is the D4 230, and that will give you 31 knots. So these D4, excluding the D6, these D4 stern drives are all the same weight. The stern drive legs all have the same drag, so the fuel consumption really won't vary significantly between engines. They'll all give you a cruising range of around 300 miles at 30 knots with a 20% reserve. So moving on to the petrol outboards, there are 3 options here. So the fastest one is the boat we have here, that's the twin 200 horsepower Mercuries, and that will give you about 45 knots. And we've also got bona fide test figures which show about 155 mile range at the same 30 knots with a 20% reserve. So that may be one of your key buying decisions. That's almost half the diesel range, so may even be your biggest consideration, or not. Although we ought to point out that we're comparing a single diesel with twin outboards here, so a single petrol outboard will give you significantly better fuel consumption in theory. So dropping down, we've got the twin 150s petrol outboards, that should give you about 39 knots, and then back down to the single 350, so that's got 88% of the power of the twin 200s, so theoretically that should give you 42 knots. However, with less drag from a single leg and less weight, I actually think you'd maybe get 45 knots, or you may even get more. So the other very significant thing to bear in mind if you're weighing petrol against diesel is that the petrol outboard boat is a livelier boat than the diesel stern drive, so they do handle differently, and that could sway you one way or the other. And there are other advantages which we'll come to talk about as well. So what about running costs? Well, if we look at annual fuel burn and we use our usual yardstick of typically 50 hours cruising, at 30 knots for average annual use, you consume about 1,650 litres of diesel. Whereas with the twin petrol outboards, on the other hand, you get through 3,250 litres, you know, roughly speaking. Although less, of course, as we mentioned, with the big 350 horsepower single outboard because of the reduced drag. So the petrol diesel battle is a really complex one, actually, and there are no hard and fast rules. There are all sorts of other issues to weigh. So the cost of servicing, the ease of servicing, the fact that with the outboard boat you actually remove an engine if it needs major remedial work, the storage under the aft deck of the petrol outboard boat, galvanic corrosion, of course, with the outboard boat. When you get back home, you simply lift the engines out of the water completely. So all sorts of pros and cons to consider, and it's worth digging out. If you go back and dig out Motorboat and Yachting's June 2015 issue, we're very lucky. This was with David and Guy again. We managed to get hold of 3 identical XO 270s, one with a 370 horsepower Volvo diesel stern drive, one with a 300 horsepower Mercury outboard, and one with a 370 horsepower Yanmar diesel stern drive. And I arrived at that test with a whole duffel bag full of preconceptions, and by the time I'd finished 3 of these concerning noise levels, speed and refinement had been dispelled. So it's well worth a read if you haven't already made up your mind between diesel and petrol boats. So the final cost we always talk about is mooring. So annual marina mooring in the Solent area would cost around 6,300 to £10,600, including that. And just a reminder that the high end we use is based on 12 months mooring at Hamble Point Marina, but paid monthly, so that's the most expensive option. And the low end we've used is mooring at Premier Swanwick Marina, but paid upfront and in full for the whole year. Let's head down the side decks and take a tour around the inside of this boat. So the beating heart of this boat is the helm position, and it's really quite an unusual one in that the whole of the lower dash tilts rather than just the wheel as would be normal. So the whole of the control panels, the major controls, tilt towards you or tilt more upright, which is a really practical feature. And then the view out from the driver's perspective is really fantastic. You've got these 2 mullions but a single uninterrupted screen otherwise, and although the mullions are quite chunky, because you stand so close to them, it doesn't take a lot of side to side movement to completely eliminate that little blind spot. And they're upright as well, of course, or largely upright, which makes their intrusion less noticeable. And one of the things that I've noticed when I'm driving this boat, and I've done so quite a lot, is that the big flared bow kicks away most of the spray, so it's quite dry, and that allows you to have one or both of the side doors open. So the ventilation through this boat is really terrific, especially when combined with this large aft opening window, so you can always get plenty of fresh air through this boat. Now this is a 25-foot boat, not a 45-foot boat, so it naturally has a limited amount of storage, and most of the storage in the saloon is in this multiplicity of little lockers and drawers here. There's an optional galley unit which is under here, but almost all the boats have this specified, so you're unlikely to come across one without this. Another little storage locker here, and then just swinging round there are storage under this helm seat here, and then there's a fridge on the port side. Now the saloon is quite naturally, for a 25-footer, quite sort of bijou, but you can arrange this space here in a number of ways. These chairs both slide and swivel, and then the table is secured on the overhead here and slides down on this pole, so you can arrange this in a whole variety of mix and match ways. It's really quite a versatile little space inside here. So if you want to head down into the cabin aft, you pivot this middle seat up and clip it to the bulkhead at the back, like so, and then you dive down the single step into the aft cabin. So down in the cabin, on the face of it, there isn't a huge amount of storage here. You've got these two little lockers here and here, another small locker under the step here, and then swinging around we've got this little locker here, a couple of hooks either side and a shelf. But what you do have, which increases the stowage no end, is these enormously long berths, which are actually a total, it's difficult to see, it's quite dark down here, but they're a total of 3.3 meters long. So you can opt to either sleep an adult and a small child sort of head to head on these, or an adult either side, and it leaves you with a huge storage area at the end, vacant for throwing kit bags and the like. So all told, for a 25-footer, the storage down here is actually really good. So what do we think of this little boat? Well, I've had a sort of love affair with this thing ever since they threw me on board one in 1998 and let me hurtle around Finland all on my own for a while, and it was a magical experience. But I actually think this boat has two different, albeit overlapping, characters. So you can treat it as a high-speed day boat and hurtle around at up to 45 knots. That's over 50 miles an hour. Pile it full of water sports toys, have a fantastic time dining out in this private foredeck area here, and then return at the end of the day. And that's maybe all you want out of it. However, on the other hand, you can also undertake some incredibly intrepid long-distance cruising trips if you so wish. This boat is really toughly built. It feels invincible when you're bashing through really foul stuff, and you feel safe and costed and protected whatever the conditions. I think the great thing for me is that it can do both of these things very, very well, not just averagely, but incredibly competently. And I would go so far as to say that that's almost unique among 25-footers.